Yeah, it's great to be back. It's been a while, but when you look at how long the rodent eradication on Lord Howe has taken, it's a long story. So the break is worthwhile. And I'm presenting this on behalf of myself and Terry O'Dwyer, who was my friend in crime on this one. He worked with me full time for 6.5 years on this project. In fact, he spent a lot more time on the island than I did, actually. So it is the rodent eradication. We're talking about rats and mice. Rats aren't particularly difficult to eradicate from islands, but mice are pretty tricky, only because their habitat is much smaller. And on an island as mountainous as this, you have to get a bait every 10 square metres. So the people who are actually doing the physical baiting activity and who were coordinating that, they were confident they'd get rid of rats. They weren't sure they'd get rid of mice, but they'd give it a good crack. And I have updated this talk as of an email I got this morning. So there is some new data. Okay, so the work I do within the science field is that looking at the biodiversity benefits of eradicating exotic rodents. The idea behind that is that it's a $1.1 million program within a $9.9 million funded program through Caring for Our Country Environmental Trust. Oh gosh, the formatting's all over the place. This is interesting. Demonstrating the outcomes of rodent eradication informs all the stakeholders, provides funding bodies, what's that, return on investment, qualifying the level of non-target vertebrate species mortality, increasing our knowledge of future operations. We should have looked at this in Google before we started. It evaluates the impacts of eradication on key non-target species and tracks their recovery. And the monitoring components, when you put the veg, the inverts, the sea and land birds together, it's integrated to identify changes to ecosystem process. So some of the environmental stats of which people will be most familiar with this, that's what that says up above. It's 500 kilometres east of Port Macquarie. It's 11 by 2 Ks, about 1,400 hectares, although that's in topographical view. When you look at all the surface, it's actually about 2,100 hectares. A 770 and 880 metre mountains, as you know, about 6.5 million years old, which makes it about 10 times older than the Galapagos, just out of interest. Only 3% of its original size. But then once you look at the biodiversity of this island, and if you understand biogeography, you realise how friggin' amazing this place is. Once home to a giant land tortoise, if you've seen the skeletal remains that are in the museum on Lord Howe, it was similar to a Galapagos tortoise. Endemic species, there's 104 endemic plants, including endemic genera. That is huge, 104 for that small land space. 600 species of invertebrates are known to be on the island, half of which are endemic. So we're talking about biodiversity here, which is just pretty mind-blowing. A giant stick insect, wood-feeding cockroaches. There's 156 species of land snails, nowhere else in the world. It's phenomenal. So in terms of the vertebrate fauna, 1 microbat, 11 endemic land birds, and 13 species of seabirds, some of which are newcomers. So some of the seabirds, because this is a bird club meeting: grey termit, black noddy, sooty tern, common noddy, mostly ground nesting, although with the rats around, you're only found it on shrubs. The white-bellied storm petrel, little shearwater, which is one of the winter breeders, wedge-tailed shearwater, common on our coast here, a flesh-footed shearwater, one of the major populations in our part of the world, black-winged petrel, which is a recent arrival, Providence petrel, one of 2 places in the world for that species, Kermadec petrel, which has been excluded from the main island, only found on Ball's Pyramid, red-tailed tropic bird, the masked booby, which is the largest seabird there, and of course the white tern. So, 1918, terrible event. Not that this actual bird's been eaten in New Zealand, but rats were introduced. Mice had already been there. They lost the white-eye, the fantail, the gerygony, the thrush, and the blackbird. And so while it looks like a tropical paradise, it's got a very dark underbelly. And it also obviously had impacts on the seabirds as well. The history of mammal invasion on Lord Howe. Well, there were 2 bat species on the island which occur there naturally, but the first introduced mammal was humans that arrived in 1788. and they brought pigs and goats soon after. And that really changed the face of the island. Even the historical knowledge of what was on the island before the rats got there were heavily impacted by these two species. First settlement was in 1840s. And mice and cats appeared by the 1860s, late 1860s. And the rats arrived with the beaching of the Macabo in 1918. And when the Australian Museum went back there in 1921, rats were widespread with bird life losses and impacts on vegetation and agriculture. It happened really quickly. So, considering an eradication for Lord Howe, we're dealing with a populated island. There were discussions in 2001 with the Lord Howe Island Board, which was started by the naturalist out there, Ian Hutton, in conjunction with David Pradell, who I used to work for, he's now retired. Between 2001 and 2003, the board funded feasibility study and a cost-benefit analysis, both of which were in favour of the eradication. DPE, which is Department of Planning and Environment, which was National Parks and Wildlife, contracted to study fauna to assist in the management decisions. And that's when I started working on the Carliles. 2007, we carried out Brodifacoum bait studies to look at the Brodifacoum was the poison of choice, which is the one that you get in your one-shot rat sack. So there's a fair bit from BirdLife about the use of Brodifacoum. It's not a very good poison to be used in broad-scale environments. 2009, the draft Lord Howe Island Rodent Eradication was released. And in 2012, the $9.9 million was coughed up both by the feds and the state government. But that's not the end of the tale. Okay, so we have had a number of previous studies that we've conducted on Lord Howe. We did work on Providence petrel, which found that the rats weren't an issue for Providence. In fact, their numbers were spreading out from the high mountains once the pigs were eradicated in the 1970s. Rats were probably having a minor impact on them. The white tern study that I carried out was published in 2015, found that rats weren't affecting the white terns at all, and I thought they were a certain candidate for that. I got 750,000 images to prove it, so there were no rats involved. Lots of corals. Okay, masked booby study, which there have been found chew marks on, or at least attempts to chew eggs from this species, and the occasional bloody chick that have been attacked by rats, but nothing serious. Fleshfoot shearwaters, no impacts on them. They seem to be doing quite well. There was a study by Tony All that looked at the little mountain palm, and it was indeed being impacted. And I also carried a study out on the endangered wood-feeding cockroach, which was missing from the main island, and an important species in terms of forest ecology. So, to make our case to the Lord Howe Island people, we had to try and find evidence to show the impacts of rats. And so I decided to target three species, the black-winged petrel, the little shearwater, and indeed the white tern, which I mentioned earlier. Mostly the small procelariids are known for being impacted by rats and mice, so I thought they were a good candidate. And the white tern, I thought, as I said before, was a given that it would be being impacted. But it's a different story. Oh, they're going very quickly. Oh, that's it. It's not doing it as I wanted to do. Okay. 2014, we carried out monthly breeding checks in non-baited areas, and we found breeding success, VS, was 0%. Surveillance cameras showed rats removing eggs and chicks. And within the baited areas, breeding success was 11% in 2014 and 2.5% in 2016. And there's a rat pulling an egg out of a burrow, which was actually being incubated at the time. Parent wasn't very impressed. There's a rat pulling a chick out of the burrow, which was about 3-week-old chick, so quite a good meal, and certainly defenceless against rats. So with the little shearwater, we used surveillance cameras. There's a camera in the foreground there, there's a burrow there. To look at rat removal, we found they removed some of the chicks, although they didn't remove eggs. Breeding success was much better at 65%, but half the known failures after hatching were due to rodents. There's also evidence of adult predation by the feral masked owl. Now, this is a rat working its way down into a burrow, it's having a sniff, going in and pulling a chick out. Quite a large one, that one. So they were basically harvesting the chicks and doing quite well. Masked owls were a particular problem. Here's one actually on a little shearwater. There's the head of a little shearwater there. The masked owls were introduced in the 1930s to control rats, which they sort of had an impact on, but not greatly. The rats were winning that war, that's for sure. We did do some tracking of masked owls back in the late noughties, and we found that the males, which are smaller than the females, were mice specialists, and the females were rat specialists, but they also ate a lot of seabirds. And this one was having a go at this little shearwater, got distracted by the camera, could somehow tell that it was taking images, and it let the little shearwater go, but chased after it. Okay, so for white terns, we carried out studies in 2013. Surveillance cameras revealed rat presence prior to nesting. In 2013-14, currawongs were responsible for all nest failures in the study area, where elsewhere the chicks fledged successfully. So this is not running as the presentation should, but I'll bear with it. Okay, so there's a camera with the classic egg on a branch. They're not balanced. They actually sit them in depressions. It just looks from down low that they're balancing them on a branch. But the cameras are really good. They allowed us to gain a fair bit of information. Here's the egg actually being laid at 9:51 on the 27th of the 11th of that year. There's the egg actually hatching with the eggshell falling away, and that's 34 days later, which is what you would expect. This is the chick being brought, it's 18 days old now, being brought quite a large fish, which it managed to eventually consume, but it was somebody else's. It was somebody else's dinner. That's going to flash quickly. The currawong came and ate it. So we're not sure whether the actual presence of the cameras was enough to bring the currawongs in, or whether they were habitually targeting particular nests. Excuse me, because they certainly found the cameras interesting as well. So we carried out other biodiversity benefit studies. We looked at ground and bark dwelling invertebrates. We gathered leaf litter and looked at the invertebrates that were in that leaf litter. We in fact collected 17,000 individuals from our year-long study. Unfortunately, we haven't had the funding to go back and do the second part of this, which is integral to understanding what's going on Lord Howe now. We did studies on the Lord Howe Island skink and the Lord Howe Island gecko. The skinks, we ran pitfall traps to trap them, attracted by pear fruit, and the geckos were done through spotlighting, and they also, their eggs, for example, were laid in fissures of trees where the mice and rats couldn't pull them out. So they were definitely in very small numbers, in very limited places on Lord Howe during the presence of rats and mice. And these photos are taken over at North Bay, which figures in something I'll tell you about later. Okay, we also used the Canberra Ornithological Group to carry out bushbird surveys, and they ended up doing several years of them because we kept on thinking the eradication was about to start, and the eradication was about to start, the eradication was about to start. But there are reasons for this, and I'll go into that. So they ran really well-constructed surveys. And the idea was that they had 48 paired plots and 7 settlement transects. From the pre-eradication results, there was 26 regular bird species recorded. No surprises, the most common species were the endemic golden whistler and the silvereye. From the transects, emerald dove, sacred kingfisher, song thrush, and woodhen all showed changes over time, although not significant. The methodology, most importantly, was statistically robust. This is not just people going out and doing their 20-minute survey or whatever. This was to actually show significant changes, and it was designed in that way to answer these specific questions. And so if anything occurred in the post-eradication monitoring in terms of declines or otherwise, it would certainly pick them up. So evaluating the threats to non-target species, this was my job. So it kept me awake at night a lot, because if it fell over, I'd be in the poop. So what we did in 2007 is we actually put 1.5 tons of non-toxic bait on specific areas on Lord Howe. And the bait was exactly the same as the one that we were going to use for the eradication, but it had no poison in it. It had a fluorescing marker, which meant that anything that ate it, when it grew whiskers, if it was a rat, they would fluoresce in the dark. If it pooed out anything after eating it, that would fluoresce. And so it allowed us to actually work out what was consuming the bait, depending on how long we were giving them to metabolize it. So I had to catch all the birds and hold them until they defecated. I had to, which was easy, you put them in a box with a white sheet and this scares the crap out of them. We also caught the rats and mice because the islanders weren't sure their rats and mice were special. And so we had to prove that they would eat the bait because they rats and mice they thought wouldn't eat the bait. But they ate the bait. That's an eviscerated mouse showing certainly that it's eaten the bait that's fluorescing in the dark. So yes, they eat the bait. Okay, so it would be disingenuous of me to say that there wasn't concern by the Lord Howe Island residents about this. Anybody with an internet connection was an expert, and we had to work against this expert opinion of these people who are well studied through the internet. And we stupidly thought that if we presented them with decent scientific arguments that we could win this. But as anybody knows, with the crank about climate change, you can't win those arguments because those people, it's almost an article of faith. And so it's not something you can win. So there was stop the drop. There was lots of negative media, no positive media because it was considered too sensitive for people to be interviewed about. Ratageddon, you know, it was pretty scary. We weren't sure it would go ahead. And one of the most important things that came out of this, besides an eradication, is that there are probably some islands in the world with human populations where it will never occur. And that's simply because the islands are too divided, in their opinion, two divided communities, and there's nothing we can do about it, even with the best science and the best will in the world. That's really one of the huge take-homes for this, and a lot of people are sitting up and taking notice of this around the world because Lord Howe Island is the largest urban population to have an eradication foisted on them. And it has been successful, as you probably know, but it has been incredibly detrimental to the social fabric on that island. Okay. And I'm saying that because I know islanders who are still dealing with it. We finished the eradication in 2019. They're still feeling the pain because it split families. It was a disaster in that way. It could have been done better if it was their idea and they got to drive it. But we assumed that they all wanted to get rid of rats, which they did. But you know, it's a really salient message for those who are thinking about eradications on other islands. Don't even think about Norfolk. Okay, so eradication versus humans. Okay, due to community disquiet and planning, research was suspended in 2014 to allow for community consultation. Following the island-wide vote, it was 52% to 48% in favour of proceeding. Just squeaked through. The eradication planning met all federal, state, human health, World Wildlife Fund, BirdLife Australia concerns, and international eradication best practice procedures. All permits were finalised, environmental impact was done, and all the monitoring plans were in place. And even with all of that, there were 2 court challenges leading into and during the eradication, which we also had to deal with. One Supreme Court challenge and one tribunal challenge. And the outcomes of those was that we had to, the worst thing was that we had to go along all the walking tracks and collect the bait that fell on the walking tracks in case the tourists thought it was food and they'd pick it up and eat it. So that was the worst thing that came out of that one. Okay, so this is really unfortunate. There are so many interesting things in this pie graph. That's a bummer. Okay, so these are a few. You can't see them all. So these are concerns that people had. The rodents will die from the bait. They thought maybe they would. The wood hens would die. The dogs will die. The women will abort their pregnancies. The coral would die. You cannot eat the fish. Can't drink the water. Soil would be poisoned. Tourists would swallow the bait. And the reason tourists would swallow the bait, the helicopter's flying over and they go, and they swallow the bait. So, although they have to swallow about 2.5, 3 kilos of it, I think. You couldn't eat your veggies. You couldn't drink the water. What else is there that's hidden? It'd destroy the Lord Howe Island brand. People wouldn't come and visit. It'd keep the tourists away. I've got the coral would die. There's a whole lot of them. So this is my pie chart. The ones to look out for is the little red one and a few others a bit further on. Okay, so eradication of rodents from Lord Howe, the actual process. This is actually a hopper getting loaded with a bag full of bait, and then the hopper is, the bait gets put into a spreader under the helicopter and taken away. So the most important thing for us is we had a human population, so all potential avenues of poison from entering the human food chain had to be eliminated. We had to slaughter the chickens, the cattle had to be slaughtered, and stock feed for those that were going to stay on the island. And several of the islanders decided that their cattle were so precious. There was a dairy herd of 8 cows, cost us $250,000 to protect them. And some people decided their chickens weren't just egg producers, they were their pets. And so we had to also manage some chickens on the island as well. And in fact, the stock, to give you an idea how long the process is, the stock is only just coming back to the island. And that's because of the ban on live exports. Because it was going from the mainland offshore, it was considered a live export. And so the conditions we had to meet to actually get stock brought back to the island was pretty huge. Okay, the aerial baiting of non-urban areas was about 12 kilos per hectare, one bait every 2 square metres. That was in June, and with a second application in July, about 8 kilograms per hectare, very weather dependent. If you got more than 40 millimetres of rain after the first baiting, the bait would swell and the rats would eat it. Although I must say, the very first day of baiting, they put out 13.5 tonnes in the southern mountains. And I went and ran 14 transects the next day, early in the morning. 6.5 tonnes was removed overnight. So some of the islanders claiming there wasn't a rat problem on the island. There was a rat problem on the island. Okay, ham broadcasting between the aerial and the bait station interface. Originally, we were going to have bait stations just in high human use areas like kids' playgrounds, the primary school, some of the common play areas for kids. But one of the CEOs in previous iterations of the board said to placate the islanders that we'll have bait stations all through the lowlands, in all urban areas, which increased the risk level enormously. And that's why those who are actually physically running the eradication, we brought in experts internationally, said, this is bad news if you want to get mice. So that was a big ask. And the reason it was a big ask, it was 21,000 bait stations, requiring 45 to 55 people to service them 6 days a week from May to November. That is a huge, huge effort. At one stage, we were employing 43% of adults on the island. So the budget went a bit south. Yeah. Altogether, 59 tonnes of exposed bait between June and August. And that contained about just over 1 litre of poison. So mostly it's a cereal bait. The sort of bait we were using, this form of brodifacoum, which you can't buy commercially, has got no bitrex in it. The bait that you buy for killing rats and mice has got a bitter agent in it, so kids will vomit it up, dogs and cats will vomit it up. It actually puts off the rats as well. The mice don't mind, they eat it. And so they have to make it 2.5 times more toxic than a bait that would actually kill rats. So they eat enough of it before the bitter agent gets too much, and they go, oh, no, I can't have any more. But it still kills them. So the bait we were using was actually 2.5 times less toxic than the bait the local islanders were using around their houses. So mitigation management and environmental monitoring. So this is the stuff we actually had to do to safeguard the species. Okay, from our work, we knew that the currawongs, there's one in a claptrap, we knew that the currawongs were going to eat rats that were dying. We knew that they had rats. I spent 120 hours watching what they brought their young at the nest in to feed. And so we knew rats were part of it, but not all of them ate the rats. And so we figured about 50 to 60% needed to go into captivity. Wood hens were a very different thing. We knew that they would love the bait. They'll also eat dying rats and mice. So we had to get as many of them into captivity as possible. We also had to safeguard all the bush birds. So this top photo here represents Terry and I at the end of our very last mitigation management walk. Every 2 days, we walked 20 kilometres through the forests of the island. 1% of the island was checked at a funerary pace. So we're walking at less than 2 kilometres an hour, searching a 5 metre wide transect for dead birds. And we found the occasional dead bird. There's a silver eye that we found. So some of the native birds did die, but we had actual cutoff points where we would have to do something if they reached that point, the number of birds that we would find. We had all these triggers in place. First time in the world this has ever been done. Okay, we also had any dead animals that were found. Sorry, I should have a warning about this. Any animals that were found were brought in and we carried out necropsies. This is a masked owl showing the green. It's been eating rats or mice that have been eating the poison. We also checked the fish. And I don't eat fish, so, you know, it wasn't like fillets for me. We checked the fish for poison. The first time this had ever been done in an eradication where it was regularly checked. We carried out water sampling, both of fresh and salt water. We searched beaches twice a day for 6 weeks, looking for any dead fish, because some of the bait was going to fall into the water, even though there were practices involved with using a masked bucket. So the bait only sprayed out one side and they'd run that along the side that was on the side of the island. We obviously had to manage getting animals off the tops of the mountains. Woodhens aren't going to fly down for us. Currawongs would, so we didn't have to go to the top of the mountains to get those. But woodhens, we actually had to get off the top of the mountains. We had large woodhen hotels, which are pods that we flew up there and loaded up with 22 woodhens at a time. And when the eradication was over, we radio tracked animals. We had initial releases, radio tracked them, and in the case of the woodhens, we actually caught them up after 2 weeks and tested their blood to look at any levels of brodifacan that might be in their blood. The mistake we made with the woodhens is we didn't actually bleed them. We didn't bleed them very much. Only tiny, small blood samples. We need a fair bit to determine brodifacan. Because we looked at a 2017 sample of woodhens that were roadkill, and we found all of them contained brodifacan. This was 2 years before the eradication. So there was so much poisoning happening on the island that all the woodhens that accidentally got killed by roadkill actually had poison in them. And in fact, it may have been the cause for some of them to die because they were suffering an overload of brodifacan when they were in the road accident. And so when we realised that we were releasing woodhen that probably had brodifacan in them already, when we came back to do the test 2 weeks later, we're going, this isn't going to be good. And sure enough, they did have a little bit of brodifacan in them. Not enough, it was barely detectable, not enough to cause any serious issue, but it was probably brodifacan they were carrying in them when we brought them into captivity. So that was our mistake, thinking that, oh, people aren't throwing the poison around outside their houses, they're only using it in bait stations in their houses. No. Okay, so the total cost of the eradication to January 2020 was 15.5 million. So we blew out our 9.9. But I did mention the use of people on to run these bait stations. Just to service those bait stations on a Saturday for those 5 months cost $800,000. Just paying the overtime for that 1 day each week. So you can see how it goes south very quickly. The budget was worked out way back in 2009 with 40% slop. We thought we were in, this was no worries, it was going to work fine. There you go. So back to that pie graph. So mostly red. That's rodents died from the bait. What a surprise. Cannot eat the fish. Even now, sea mullet have a little bit of brodifacan in their livers. And since everybody eats fish liver all the time, not, they're basically told through the whole of the eradication, during the early part of the baiting, we detected some brodifacan in flesh at very low levels, certainly not levels that would harm human health. But the advice was to don't eat the fish during the actual eradication process. And then afterwards, it was only found in livers and then only in livers of sea mullet. So they're still detectable 2 years later because they're a bottom feeder. And so there must be some bait still not fully broken down or somehow entered the system within the marine environment. This has never been tested before. So this is all new. And we did kill some birds. The worst one to go down was the buff-banded rail because it worked out it could get into the bait stations. And they were being loaded up for 5 months with bait. So if we'd actually run it how we originally were going to run it, which is with very few bait stations, it would have been very minimal, but there was 21,000 of them across the settlement. And it was only the buff-banded rails in the settlement whose numbers got affected, but they only reached to 49% of the trigger where we needed to do something. So it wasn't a disaster for buff-banded rails, which the locals shoot anyway, because they ping their tomatoes and stuff like that. Okay, so yes, all the rats died and all the mice. So what are some of the early indications? Masked boobies started nesting where people hadn't seen them ever, because simply they were landing in sites that were a good place to breed, and they weren't getting harassed by rats at night. So the rats weren't taking their young, they were simply harassing them at night. So they'd fly off and go, this is no good. We found black-winged petrels laying eggs on the surface and incubating on the surface. You know, these guys, this is at North Head, where we had 0% breeding success. They didn't even get past the egg stage there. Silver eyes totally changed their behaviour from what anybody had ever known. They were in such huge flocks on the ground, they'd never been seen foraging on the ground because there was never any food there. In fact, they're the worst for roadkill now on Lord Howe because they don't know anything about cars. They, you know, you get 20 killed in a flock by cars doing 25 k's an hour and they don't lift off the road fast enough. People are finding geckos on the garbage bins. Okay, this is a species where you would have to go all the way over to North Bay if you were lucky to find them. This is the inside of a palm stem. These are snail eggs. People were finding them loaded up on the palms in the mountains. The fruit crops on the palms, previously very limited, because baiting, if they didn't bait in areas where palms were, they would not have a fruit crop on them, massive loads. Lots of snails turning up. Some of the ones which they thought were possibly extinct, they hadn't seen them for 60 years, are now turning up again. So there's lots of anecdotal evidence that things are going in the right direction. Biosecurity is really, really important. 2 permanent detector dogs, 371 monitoring devices, 99.8%. That's not 100. So in April 2021, they had an incursion, 3 locations, all within the settlement, all at places where they set down pallets from the ship. This is, I know we've had floods this year, but if you cast your mind back to last year, the Hastings River had a huge flood in March and into early April in 2021. And in fact, the rat-proof shed that had been built there had a metre of water through it. The next month, rats turn up in the settlement, 95. That probably started with only 7 or 8, but they were already breeding by the time they caught the last ones. So they spent over $2 million getting rid of those rats. A lot of money. So there are no signs of what was important with that. They ran about 500 cameras, cost them a fortune. There was no signs of rats in the permanent park reserve, and most importantly, no sign of mice anywhere. So normally what happens when you do an eradication, happened in 2019, normally by 2021, 2 years later, you do a check to actually work out what's going on. This incursion occurred only about 4 months before the check was going to happen. But the amount of effort they spent looking for rats and finding no sign of mice anywhere is brilliant. And nothing in the permanent park reserve. The only evidence of rats was in the settlement, where possibly they came in on these pallets. So the biosecurity has been significantly improved by a $33 million government announcement that's been delivered to the island for the next 4 years to pick up their biosecurity, because they realised this was a huge mistake and it shouldn't have occurred. The government wasn't taking it seriously enough. The board, nobody was taking it seriously enough. The New Zealand people who came in went, oh my God, you've done what? In terms of how they are running their biosecurity. We've never had to deal with this. In New Zealand, they had to deal with it heaps. They know what it's done to their flora and fauna. They deal with it all the time. So things have improved enormously, which is fantastic. So some biodiversity benefits for seabirds, black-winged petrel. Okay, so we're not going to see everything. So this is North Head is this blue line. So some of the eggs survived through to February. By March, they're all gone. This is Blinky's Beach, which is down in the lowlands. Similar fate, but I think we had 1 nest survive. This is pre-rats. Okay. This blue one here is Phillip Island. So we actually looked at an island off Norfolk, which has got black-winged petrels on it, but no rats. And you do lose a few eggs anyway, because birds aren't always good at incubating, but you end up with about a 50% breeding success, which is what you would expect. And then this is what happened on Lord Howe after the eradication. So we lost a few eggs, 60 to 70% breeding success. in the absence of rats and mice. So fantastic for black-winged petrels. Tick. Okay, Lord Howe woodhen. So what happened to them? 1970s, population reduced to about 22 individuals. The early 80s, captive breeding secured the population, and annual surveys after about 86 to 2000 found the population had stabilised at about 200, 250. They were identified for captive management for the REP. We brought in 228 individuals and successfully held them from May all the way through to January. We were originally only going to hold them for 3 months, but because of all the ground baiting that was occurring for so long, because they were using so many bait stations, we had to hold them for a really long time. Taronga Zoo did that. They did a brilliant job. But when we went to release them, particularly the mountain birds, we found 10 individuals surviving in the wild after the baiting. So even though we thought they'd all go down with bait, there were some that actually survived out in the wild, which was fantastic. But what happened afterwards is bloody brilliant. Okay, so we're talking about 220, 215 into captivity, 443 in the first year, 608 in the second year, 778 in the third year. They haven't stopped breeding. Literally, they haven't stopped breeding. I don't know when they molt, because they're pretty busy. It is phenomenal. The change is phenomenal. So heaps more roadkill, because people aren't used to having woodhens coming out of their wazoos all over the place. They certainly are now. It's amazing. And the story's not over yet. The woodhen are still expanding. The food resource has gone through the roof. But it's not all good. Black-winged petrels. These are our cameras that we use. This is Blinky's Beach in North Head. The number of rats we saw during a specific period, 230, 564 at North Head, which is where we lost all our eggs and they didn't even breed well. So that was the difference that control baiting did between the two sites. Interestingly, 34 woodhens at Blinky's Beach, none at North Head. We saw 3 woodhens at Blinky's Beach in 2020. We got 261 woodhens at Blinky's Beach in 2021. Guess what they like eating? They like eating the adults if they can get them. That's a black-winged petrel getting pulled out of a burrow by its wing. Breeding success has gone down for black-winged petrels. 23% at last check. So they are having impacts on the seabirds. So it's not all good news, but it is good news. You know, the woodhens and the seabirds did coexist on the island before. We just don't know how yet. Something we've got to look into.
Blackwings were never there anyway.
Well, they were never there, yeah. The white blackwings, but the little shearwaters were. So similar problem. So the Lord Howe currawong, endemic subspecies, largest native predator. Annual surveys, which I commenced in 2005, stable population, 220. Identified 56% that we held in the captive management. We had 118 individuals in there, held through to September, but up to 80 individuals survived in the wild because we had most of them colour banded. So not all of them were smashed. But what buggered us, this is a currawong with a bait in its bill. So when we carried out our trial baiting in 2007 with non-toxic bait, we never found the currawongs eating the bait because there were so many rats and mice on the island, they were removing it before the currawongs even got to pick it up. So these guys were actually eating the bloody bait, the buggers. They're just, I don't know if you know them on Lord Howe, but they're incredibly curious. They weren't always eating it, they were sometimes just playing with it. But yeah, they were taking the bait. But we only found, in all our travels, I think we only found 3 dead currawongs, but obviously the population took a hit. And that's what we found. In our October to December survey 2020, we found a decline from our population estimates from down to about 211 individuals. Annual monitoring by Charles Sturt Uni found nesting had also declined, but juvenile survival, which is important, may be increasing. Then we had surveys in 2021 that found significant increases on the 2018 levels. And I'll just show you a little bit of that. We couldn't get COG back out there, the Canberra Ornithological Group. COVID in 2020 spring, COVID in 2021 spring. Thanks Delta, whatever it was. So I had to get a few people out there trained up because I couldn't even travel to the island to do the nest surveys and the general surveys. And what they've basically found, these are the chance of seeing the percentage that you might see in a plot. So that went from 2 to 4, it doubled. And it's highly significant. The only one that went down was purple swamp hen. So they weren't very common, but they were less common afterwards. And that's because they certainly took the bait. We weren't particularly worried about that. The locals shoot them all the time. They hate them on the island because of damage to the greens at the golf course, what they do in people's gardens. They shoot them on Norfolk as well. But they readily recolonised. They got there themselves in 1969 was the first time they bred. So we weren't particularly worried about purple swamp hens. Buck-banded rails, we thought they were getting hit hard. They're coming back more than ever now. Australian kestrels look like those numbers might increase because the amount of invertebrate foods that are available for them has increased. And interestingly, emerald dove, this was the one I was most worried about. One of the guys who was running the eradication, he thought we'd kill all the sacred kingfishers. Says you're going to take them out, mate. I mean, it's not an endemic species, but they are an island naive species. So we really didn't want to lose them, but the data didn't show that. But I couldn't find emerald doves eating the bait, even though it was a cereal bait. And I was really nervous about these guys, but they didn't take the bait. The only emerald doves that were handed in during the eradication were roadkill. So that was really good news. And welcome swallows doing about the same. So vertebrates and invertebrates significantly improved. Seabirds will do well. Potential return of offshore species such as the white-bellied storm petrel and the Kermadec petrel. The native flora will recover over time. There's the reintroduction of the phasmid, which is a giant stick insect stuck on Ball's Pyramid out the back there somewhere. Or the wood-feeding cockroach. There's also the tantalising chance of introducing the lost bush birds. There's 4 species from Norfolk that are similar subspecies to the ones that died on Lord Howe that could be reintroduced there. But that's a long-term program. Huge invasive weed issues without management. Assistance in recovery of some seabird species. We've got to actually see how these burrowing birds are going against the wood hen onslaught, and a long-term investment in biosecurity. But I've got a few updates. One is that we don't have to worry about reintroducing the wood-feeding cockroach. I was on the island in July with an honours student from Sydney University. We were actually working on the offshore islands on these wood-feeding cockroaches. This is what they look like. They're not like the ones you get in your house. These, you find them in your wood heap if you've got wood heaps. That's Panacea is the genus. And what they are is they're not a wood-feeding cockroach. They actually live in the soil. And these guys grab a leaf. I've studied them out on Blackburn at night. They grab a leaf and they pull it underground to eat it up. And they actually condition about 4 centimetres of the soil. So on Blackburn Island, that's a big fig. On Blackburn Island, you turn a rock over that hasn't got Panacea underneath it, the wood-feeding cockroach, and it's compacted basalt-based soils. But you turn over a rock that's got the cockroaches underneath and it's friable soil full of organic matter. So missing these guys from the main island of Lord Howe is a significant loss to the functioning ecology of the island. And so I had Maxim out there. He was stoked that he could see a live one because he'd only been playing with dead ones for the museum. And so he was very excited. But we needed to get out to roach because he was interested in collecting them because I found them out on roach. We already knew they were there. But the seas were too big. And I said, oh, mate, you're doing your honours. You need to collect null data. So why don't we go to places on the main island where they should be and show that they're not there? At least you've got some data. 0 is okay. You went, oh, that's a good idea. So I went to North Bay because that's the place where if they were going to survive, we know the skink and the gecko are there, Placostylus, a large land snail is there in very low numbers because it's always been a haven. It was the ark of palm seed because there was a palm industry on the island for about 70 years. And so we knew it was a good place. So I took him to a similar banyan with rocks underneath it. The first rock we turned over, there's Panacea underneath. Hadn't been seen on the main island for 80 years. Okay, some of the best experts in the business have been over there. They've been looking under wood. They hadn't taken the key of what was happening out on Blackburn. They're under rocks. And I wrote a paper about this in 2014 and never actually went to search the main island. And yeah, found them under the first tree that we searched. In fact, Maxim spent a week looking under all the other banyans at North Bay. No, it was just under this one. And news this morning, they've done genetic sampling. The data's just come back today. So these guys on the main island, this is the one from Blackburn in the lagoon. These guys on the main island they've been isolated. These two populations have been isolated for tens of thousands of years. So probably last sea level rise that affected the lagoon. What's really amazing is Maxim had already done some DNA work on a material that was available from the main island, from museum specimens, and Roach Island, which is a kilometre offshore. They've been isolated for 3 million years. This is a non-flighted cockroach. That's when the centre of the island blew out, when it was still an active area for volcanoes, and created that calcarenite sandy area in the middle of the island. And so fascinating creatures. So that's the most recent up-to-date data I've got. So, questions? Thank you.
Are the islanders now in favour of baiting for rats and mice?
I suppose you're suggesting, did we get an apology? The answer is no.
So how are the local people dealing with the new influx of?
Well, there's a term that's now been heard on the island. I've never seen that before. So there are common plants there, native plants. They're seeing flowering for the first time. People who've spent their whole life on the island.
And they're happy.
They think it's fantastic. Sure, but don't expect an apology.
How would the rodent eradication compare if you did that on Christmas Island, for argument's sake?
Has it got humans on it?
Christmas Island certainly has.
Bad chance, mate. Right, for that very reason, you're not going to see it occur unless the islanders decide they want it and that they are unanimously in agreement. Otherwise, it won't happen. So I could not offer you an opinion on that.
I mean, there were people on Christmas Island that loved the cats that are run. So,
Right.
so it's kind of,
Yeah, it would be an island by island thing. It's not something you could say. I mean, scientifically, it'd be bloody brilliant, obviously, and we can do it. We've got the technology, but it's not for us to decide ever.
So on Macquarie Island, for instance, the mice are the problem there now.
Well, they've got rid of the mice off Macquarie. So, but there was only 70 scientists there and government workers, so they had to put up with whatever they were told they had to put up with. So this is the first fully urbanised. We've got a primary school with 40 kids in it. We've got 27,000 tourists, or no, actually it's not that many, 17,000 tourists arriving. So it's a very different kettle of fish. They were afraid of the brand. Get your question in a second. They were afraid of the brand being damaged. And in fact, they delayed the eradication in 2018, but by then they were already doing eradication tourism. And it was gangbusters through winter. They never had so many people on the island. So come 2019, it was gangbusters again. There were so many people wanting to get out there to see the eradication happen.
Are all the rats gone?
All the rats are gone and all the mice. They're definitely gone, which is hard to believe. And it's hard to imagine how many there were on the island. The mice, actually, interestingly, the mice owned the grasslands, the airfields, people's lawns. No sooner had the baiting started than people were finding emerald doves all over their lawns. What are they doing here? They're eating all the stuff the mice used to eat, because mice can build a burrow. Rats live in harbour, generally. They don't tend to, black rats don't tend to dig holes. They'll live in some place that gives them security, but mice actually dig holes. So they're the only ones who could exploit the resources in flat lawns because they burrowed. And so the change was almost within 2 weeks, there was behavioural change on the birds, even though the eradication went for quite some time. It was that quick. Yeah, we got them all.
But you had to use dogs there as well, didn't you?
Well, dogs have been part of the process always, both because we wanted to ensure that areas were cleared, and they can detect most rats and mice, but we know they don't detect everything, and they can't tell the difference between really recent or alive. Okay. The other thing is that we were a little frightened of sabotage. There are people who are so viscerally against not rats and mice. It had nothing to do with rats and mice and everything to do with the islanders' relationship with the local government, the Lord Howe Island Board. So when the helicopters were on the island, we had people sleeping with the helicopters the whole time they were on the island. That's how concerned we were.
I've just got a question about the slide where you showed the woodhens impact on the blackwings.
Yep.
2 questions, and you mentioned little shears. Have you got any data on the impacts of woodhens on little shears?
We'd love to. We our biodiversity benefits funding got swallowed up. The post-eradication got swallowed up in the blowout of the budget. So we haven't received anywhere near the money that we had hoped to. We've collected a little bit of data, but there is some significant data, particularly the invertebrate stuff, which is driving this system. And we would really love to go out and collect that. Yeah.
My other question is more of a gut feeling question. With the black wings colonising all over the place, might they be a roadblock for some of the white bellies and the Kermidecs to return to the main island? Okay, for the people who are at home, the question was with the black wing petrels spreading out, may they be a roadblock for the littles, for the white bellies or the Kermidecs? Our biggest problem for the white bellies or the Kermidecs is not black wing petrels, it's woodhen. One is a very small seabird, which would be an easy meal for a woodhen because it forages at night, woodhens. The reason they haven't been able to is because there hasn't been the food resource. It's now there. And for Kermidec petrels, they're a surface nester. Oh my God, is that a meal for a woodhen or not? So our biggest trick, and this is something I'm about to start, I've received SOS funding, is to work out where these buggers were nesting before the rats arrived. But the problem is the only data we've got is from Roy Bell, who grew up on the Kermadec Islands. He was out there collecting eggs and specimens for museums. And he was there in 1913. Pigs had been there for 100 years, and pigs are a destroyer of seabirds. So Roy Bell, for example, found Kermadec petrel on a place called the Razorback, which is literally the top of Mount Gower, over the top. You walk along a ledge that is at literally the width of this table. On this side, it seriously goes down 600 metres. On this side, it drops only about 200 metres. And it is this wide. It's called the Razorback. Right down the end of that is where he collected them because the pigs couldn't get up there. So I don't fancy setting up a colony up there, but I will go. I've been on the Razorback. I will go there and I'll look at what the vegetation looks like because that helps me understand what is good Kermadec petrel habitat on Lord Howe Island. Then I've got to go somewhere else and find places where it looks similar, where the bloody woodhens can't get to. So that's my trick. So it's less about the blackwings and more about dealing with rampaging woodhens. Sorry, there's another question.
What would be the limiting factor on woodhens before the rats?
Good question. And look, this is one of the things, it's a bit gory. This is one of the things, the only measure we have of woodhens on Lord Howe before the rats got there was when the first Europeans arrived. They discovered a good quick way to get a bag full of food was to break the legs of a woodhen, put it on the ground, and it would call out, and within earshot, 20 woodhen would come in and you could knock them on the heads. So within earshot of a woodhen, there were 20 woodhens within that habitat. And that was the only measure of density. We're not quite there yet, but we're getting closer. So the limitation for woodhens was food resource, which has now gone through the roof and we haven't seen a plateau yet. So I'd love to go back and do the invert work as a baseline to find out what's happening, which is driving most of the bush bird recovery on the island.
So two very different questions. One is, how long does the bait kind of last, or is it biodegrade? Yep,
good question. Yeah, I'll answer that one first and I'll come back to you for the second one. One of the things we had to do was we actually had to follow bait breakdown. And that was our job as the scientists, because that told us when there was no longer bait in the environment, so when it was safe to release the birds. And so we actually had 20 sites around the island where bait had fallen. We actually marked the bait because we wanted to test the soil underneath the bait. We also had cages set up when the last bait was dropped by helicopter. We went out and set up 18 cages in all different environments and watched the bait break down, how long it took. We had measured it before in 2007, and we found when we put it in a fine mesh cage, it took about 100 days to break down if nothing ate it. But the thing we didn't factor in was slugs. Slugs love this bait, doesn't impact them at all, you know. And what was happening was, because when we did our 2007 check, we had this really fine mesh cage, the slugs couldn't get in. We were just using cages big enough to stop birds getting in. Slugs were going through, the bait was gone in about 3 weeks. Woof. It disappeared. And so it was very quick. When we went to check the soil underneath, we did studies on that. There was no residual stuff in the soil. There was nothing in the creeks, nothing in the ocean. And it's because the way brodifacoum works, the way it breaks down very quickly into constituent non-toxic parts, very, very quickly. Although there is an issue with filter feeders, and this may have something to do with what's happening with the mullet. And we know that from New Zealand when they were doing the baiting, the Auckland Islands, the $1 million mouse project on the Auckland Islands in New Zealand. There was a semi-trailer heading down the coast, south coast of New Zealand, and it rolled over and fell into the sea, and they had 40 tonne of bait in one spot. And so they've done some studies of what happened to the toxicity in that area, and it still turned up in the mussels for a little while afterwards. So there's something going on there. But in terms of terrestrial environments, nothing. It's very, very quick. Your second question. Sorry, there's such long answers.
That's good.
Despite everything, the backlash and all that, given the success of it, do you think that kind of bodes well for potentially other islands doing the same?
Be good, wouldn't it? No, I like getting rid of ferals, but I won't say anything more than that. I can't really answer that. Don't know. Every island on its merits. If it comes from the people on the island, it would be a success.
Does Norfolk Island have the same problem?
Oh yes, huge. It lost its most recent terrestrial bird, which was one of the silver eyes, in early 2000s. The previous bird it lost in 1978. So there, and that was our concern with Lord Howe. One of the greatest pleasures I had in springtime on Lord Howe was hearing the cicadas. They'd survived. They have an endemic cicada. I was working in Bermuda in 2000, enjoying the cicadas. Rats have been there 300 years. I went there in 2009, they were gone. So it's this insidious thing. What tips them over? We were so worried that the silver eye and the golden whistle, because no one was looking at them closely, who would give you money to do that. How close were they to that tipping point that happened to the silver eye on Norfolk Island in 2000? I got there in 2006 on Norfolk to work on seabirds, doing a quick run around and looking at the birds. I was going, where's your robust silver eye? And they went, oh yeah, we haven't seen that. What the? So it's really scary. Rats lead you to a point where things can tip, everything seems fine, and then they're gone. And that is a real concern, definitely.
Are there any other or planned studies going forward to check for similar, potential issues similar to the wood end? No,
I'd love to say yes.
Yeah, so it's around funding.
Do they have plans to get rid of the mask down?
Oh yeah. Whew. Yeah, no, the plan was that they would hopefully go down in the eradication. And they spent 6 months on shooters afterwards. We've been running song. It's a whole new different story, the last hour. We interestingly, something's just about to get published. During the eradication, we had a booble cow turn up dead. Now, Lord Howe had an endemic booble cow. Last one was heard in 1955. And it was probably outcompeted by the masked owl, not for resources, but probably the juveniles were taken by masked owls because the masked owls out there would eat currawongs at night. I found currawong tail feathers sticking out of their boluses, out of their regurges. So the booble cow, the native booble cow, probably got wiped out by the juveniles being eaten. And the period between 1930 and 1955 is probably the age an adult owl, a booble cow would have survived, that had hatched out and fledged before the masked owls arrived. So yes, definitely getting rid of the masked owls. We've been running song meters, not quite solidly, because there hasn't been a lot of funding. We think we're down to maybe one individual. But what's been really interesting, all the owls that have been shot after the eradication have all been female. And that's possibly because of this breakup between the males ate the mice and the females ate the rats. And so the males were a mouse specialist. And so they probably went down very quickly during the eradication, but still checking.
Is there a chance to reintroduce a single vehicle, obviously nothing.
Hit the nail on the head, my friend. Well, we originally were thinking that we'd love to get the hybrid from Norfolk because ecologically it is the most threatened in terms of its gene pool. You probably know the story got down to a single female. They brought 2 males, which without genetic checking, but correct by Penny, they brought 2 males from New Zealand. One of them bred with the female, produced 34 offspring before she died. And so we would love to, but unfortunately, the boo book, or the Moorpork they call it, on Norfolk has taken a dive in terms of its breeding. Had something to do with one of the managers back in 2008 who took over the island and didn't like the nest boxes that were up 8 metres because they were a work health and safety issue. So he got them all put down to 3 metres and they never had any owls breeding them. So that's really weird. They put them back up again now.
Do you find similar resistance when you talk with the islanders regarding getting rid of mast owl?
No, they hated them because they killed the white terns. In fact, they hated the Carliles because they killed the white terns too. So they used to shoot the Carliles all the time.
Yeah.
So yeah.
It's funny that, yeah, like the mast owl, they're happy to
Yeah, well,
get rid of it.
the mast owl is actually a hybrid. So they produced, because the original thought was, you know, why don't we just catch these owls and send them back to the mainland? They're endangered over here. And it's because they introduced both the Tasmanian and the mainland form. And genetics showed that they were a hybrid. The zoos didn't want them, no one wanted them. So, you know, basically people souvenir the feathers whenever we brought one into the office. Anyway, you've exhausted me.